Sisters and brothers, please welcome the next Prime Minister of Canada, Tom Mulcair.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. What energy in this room. Quelle énergie. Je vois que vous avez tous survécu à notre petit voyage en bateau hier soir. Plaisir de vous revoir. Les travailleurs unis de l'alimentation et du commerce, TUAC, sont depuis longtemps une voix forte et crédible pour le droit des travailleurs et des travailleuses, et je tiens à vous féliciter et à vous remercier. That's good. That's good. You're just going to have to clap with the tone of voice. That's perfect. You're going to know when you're supposed to clap, even if it was in French. It's a pleasure to see so many brothers and sisters from all over the United States and Canada. You know, I've had the chance to speak to the UFCW a number of times since becoming leader of the New Democratic Party, and each time I have the pleasure to do so, I'm struck by your incredible enthusiasm and your extraordinary commitment. I see it again here today. Thank you to Joe, to my dear friend and colleague Wayne Hanley, and to the members of the Executive Board for such a warm welcome. You know, the Canadians in the room will be able to tell you the close bond that exists between the New Democratic Party and the UFCW. And I sincerely could not be prouder than to tell you that it was actually Wayne who nominated me at the New Democratic Leadership Convention last year in Toronto. On both sides of the border, leaders like Wayne, Joe, and all of you here today are providing incredible leadership. Not only are you protecting the rights of more than 1 million workers, you're leading the way in organizing new members and new union locals. And as we'll see, that's more important than ever. The UFCW is re-energizing and revitalizing the labor movement, and that's no small feat in this day and age when this work is more important than ever. Together, New Democrats and the UFCW are leading the fight to strengthen and protect collective bargaining rights in Canada, on the picket lines, in the workplace, and in government. Together, we will be the voice of working men and women in the 21st century, because that's what being part of a union is all about. Today, the labour movement faces a pivotal moment in its history. Throughout the last century, progressive organizations in North America and around the world worked in solidarity to help drive the greatest reduction of inequality in human history. We changed the way people work and the way they live. Little things like the weekend and workplace health and safety. Those benefited all workers, unionized or not, but they were driven by the union movement. And we did it all while fostering the largest economic expansion the world has ever known. But today, those gains are once again under attack. You know, there was a time when average folks from San Diego to St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador could rely on a decent job with fair wages to support their family. What we saw were jobs with a salary that was enough for a family to live on properly, and it came with a pension that you could rely on that would be there for you at the end. That's not the case anymore. Today, workers are no longer seen as the engines of our economy, as the men and women who drive growth and bring innovation to life. Today, organized labor is being portrayed as an impediment to profits, one that must be overcome, defeated. In Canada, the Conservative government makes no effort to mask its contempt for working men and women. Open hostility is a source of pride amongst neoconservatives and neoliberals. This is manifested in their outright attacks on the vital benefits and services that Canadians rely on. They've slashed funding for public health care. They've raised the retirement age from 65 to 67. And they've told unemployed Canadians that if they aren't prepared to take a 30% pay cut, they could lose their employment insurance altogether. We see it in heavy-handed interference and repeated back-to-work legislation that undermines and seeks to destroy historically guaranteed collective bargaining rights. We face a government in Canada that's not only allowing some of our most profitable companies to exploit cheap labour, it's encouraging and even helping them to do it. This is a government, and I'm not exaggerating here, that actually allowed companies to pay temporary foreign workers 15% less than what they would pay Canadian workers. These are workers who are deprived of their full rights and are often at the mercy of their employer. What we've been facing in both Canada and the United States is the ultimate goal of Conservatives since Reagan-Thatcher: to lower working standards and wages, to tell workers that they have to accept less, to tell our children that they have to accept less, and to convince the public there is no alternative. Well, the UFCW deserves full credit for fighting this low-wage, cheap labour agenda. In Canada, the UFCW has led the way in demanding better conditions for temporary foreign workers. It's fighting to organize them, to ensure that they have the same rights as any other Canadian worker. And the UFCW has also fought side by side with the NDP to protect health care, employment insurance, and retirement benefits. But with a government that's so openly hostile to working men and women, it's a constant battle. Here in the United States, so-called right-to-work legislation continues to be the single biggest threat to workers and to the livelihoods of our families. In Idaho alone, where union-busting legislation was enacted 4 years ago, the number of workers represented and protected has been cut in half. And other key states have followed suit in attacking the rights of workers. Let me tell you, few things embolden anti-labour groups in Canada more than watching what happened in Michigan last year. We heard the same old arguments that you've all heard. Corporations have to stay competitive. Workers have to have the freedom to choose. But you know, and I know, the real agenda behind this legislation. In states with these sorts of aggressive anti-union laws, workers are earning, on average, $1,500 less per year. That's a fact. These workers are less likely to have health insurance and less likely to be protected by safety procedures and rules. The only freedom that workers are gaining is freedom from a fair wage. In Canada, we're calling out this agenda for what it is: an attack on livelihoods, an attack on lives. We have an obligation to fight back and to win back those rights. You know, because you've heard them as I have, Conservatives like to argue that there's no real need for labour unions these days. Sure, maybe unions had their place in the shadows of the Great Depression, where income inequality was rampant and sweatshops were commonplace, but those problems are gone, Conservatives like to say, and everybody's doing just fine on their own. It's an argument based more on ideology than on fact. The truth is, today we face levels of income inequality not seen since the Great Depression. In the past 35 years, income has grown only for the top 20%. It has actually shrunk for the other 80%. While our economy as a whole has grown by 147%, the typical family has seen their income drop by 7%. If we continue down this path, we face the stark reality of becoming the first generation in history that will actually leave less to our children than what we inherited from our own parents. We find that unacceptable. Governments around the world have watched a generation of middle-class jobs disappear, and yet they've done nothing to create the next generation of middle-class jobs. The fact is, the greatest inequality we face today is the growing gap between generations, and that gap is only getting worse. We're leaving the largest ecological, economic, and social debt in history in the backpacks of our kids, and we're living on their credit card. Since the 2008 recession, Canada, the United States, and other developed countries have struggled to regain the well-paid, high-quality jobs that have traditionally been the backbone of our economy. In Canada, regions that are usually prosperous, for example, Southern Ontario, one of the largest industrial and financial centres of our country, now face unemployment that's higher than the national average. Even when employment numbers do go up, the jobs created are often low-wage, part-time, and precarious. In Toronto alone, that's Canada's largest city, a staggering 50% of workers don't have a stable full-time job. Instead, they're forced to rely on part-time jobs, split shifts, and contract work. Parents are seeing less and less of each other. Children and families are paying the price. Here in the U.S., nearly 60% of all the job losses during the recession were those of the middle class. Yet since 2010, nearly 60% of the jobs recovered in the U.S. have been low-wage jobs, not the middle-class ones that were lost. These are jobs that often pay minimum wage, a salary that keeps workers right on the cusp of poverty. That's about the situation now. And think about it. We're talking about bookkeepers, administrative assistants, middle-class folks who lost their job in the recession and who are now working 2 jobs at $7.25 an hour. We're talking about students who've graduated with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, nearing their 30s, and still working entry-level jobs, low-wage jobs, just to pay the interest. This is the new reality of our low-wage economy, and it's not sustainable. Now, of course, according to low-wage companies like McDonald's, the problem isn't that its employees earn a salary that keeps them in poverty. No, it's that they simply don't know how to budget properly. So, McDonald's executives teamed up with Visa last month to create a sample budget to show its employees how they should be spending their money. The trouble is, to make the budget work, the company had to assume that their employees were working a second full-time job. Oh, and it budgeted a grand total of $0 for food, $0 for clothing, oh yes, and $0 for heat. Clearly, it's been a while since any executive at McDonald's has had to worry about a household budget. Is it any wonder that fast food employees in an industry worth some $200 billion a year, by the way, have taken to the streets to demand fair wages and the right to unionize? Or that despite hostile legislation, public support for labor unions in the U.S. has jumped significantly over the past 2 years alone? Is it any wonder that in Canada, more and more young workers stuck in precarious jobs are turning to unions like the UFCW for support? Soyons clairs. Un mouvement syndical fort est aussi essentiel aujourd'hui qu'à tout moment dans notre histoire. Ceux qui disent autrement ignorent tout simplement les faits. Let there be no mistake. A strong labor movement is as essential in our society today as at any time in our history. Anyone who says otherwise is simply denying reality. We live in an age of unparalleled innovation. We have greater human potential than ever before, and a greater ability to put that potential to work. Therefore, what confronts us today isn't a failure of ability, but a lack of political will. Conservatives on both sides of the border have championed a vision where government just gets out of the way, where we're all left to fend for ourselves. It has been 30 years since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher told us that if only governments would butt out of the economy, wealth would, what did they used to say? Wealth would trickle down. Well, they've been trickling on workers for 30 years, and enough is enough. What we're seeing today what we've seen growing over the past 3 decades isn't just a debate over the precise level of tax rate for people earning over a certain amount. The debate is far more essential, far more fundamental than that. It's a debate about the kind of government we want and the sort of society we want. Across the board, conservative governments are gutting rules meant to protect the public and imposing industry self-regulation instead. And we see that in case after case. In Canada, after $46 million in cuts to food safety, last year we saw the largest beef recall in Canadian history. Well, ask Carl Arston what's going to happen in a meatpacking plant if you ask the employer and the bosses to evaluate themselves. That's a little bit like asking students to evaluate their own exams. So it's not surprising we've seen results like that. After years of loosening environmental protections in 2010, 1 million gallons of oil spilled out of a pipeline in Michigan and into the Kalamazoo River. And we're seeing that type of environmental disaster across North America. Because those rules aren't there to annoy business, they're there to protect future generations so that they have a right to the same thing we've had. Just this summer, in fact, just a few weeks ago, 47 people were killed when a train filled with crude oil derailed and exploded in a small town in Quebec. Now, experts from the Transportation Safety Board and Transport Canada are still investigating the role that decades of deregulation played in the tragedy of Lake Megantic. But it's that mentality, that regulations that exist to protect the public, what could be more important? in all the things that a government does than protecting human lives. What is the role of deregulation in this type of debacle? That is a serious conversation we're going to have. The dismantling of these basic health, safety, and environmental protections were sold to the public on the promise that they would somehow magically pave our path to prosperity. In fact, it's part of what's called the Washington Consensus. As the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank imposes conditions on economies around the world, deregulation is one of the key aspects. But deregulation often means failure to protect human lives. And the greatest irony of all, it was exactly this sort of unfettered deregulation that led to the greatest global economic crisis since the Great Depression. In Canada, we were being pushed to allow our banks to deregulate. The NDP held the anchor fast. The Liberals and the Conservatives attacked us. We held the anchor fast. We stood up to them. We said, it makes no sense. Now that those banks have largely weathered the 2008 crisis, the Conservatives and the Liberals love to snap their suspenders and say what a great bunch of managers they are. But they wanted Canadian banks to go the way of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. We were the ones who were saying that that banking system existed for the public, and we insisted it continue to be regulated in the public interest. Where governments once took a leadership role in protecting the public interest, now they protect only private interests. And in doing so, they've sacrificed our long-term prosperity for their short-sighted political gain. A report earlier this year by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, found that aggressive tax planning by multinational corporations is not only eroding the tax base of many countries, it's threatening the integrity of the international tax system. Look at a company like BP. You remember them? The ones who brought you Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico? Well, BP operates in over 100 countries, and it has 200 subsidiaries, affiliates, and related companies. They move money around, they ascribe it to those countries where there's no tax on this part of the revenue, and they just move it around like a giant shell game. Most of these major companies wind up paying no taxes, or nearly no taxes. And the British Tax Justice Network, an organization that does extraordinary work in this regard, says that the international tax havens and tax loopholes are costing countries tens of trillions of dollars, all told. That is undermining the very foundation on which our prosperity and our society is built. The companies that benefit most from our public institutions, police system that's not corrupt, a court system that's independent, an education system that costs a fortune, an infrastructure that has to be maintained. Those companies have used all of that to make the money, but now they're seeking to skip out on their share of the bill by paying no taxes. They want to leave it to someone else to pay for the very institutions that allowed them to make the profits in the first place. That is the harsh reality of deregulation. Now, of course, the private sector will always be central to our economy and the engine of economic growth, but there's a common sense role for the government to play in protecting the public. We all know what's at stake: ensuring working men and women earn a fair wage, ensuring banks and large companies play by the rules and pay their fair share, ensuring the food we eat and the air we breathe are safe. Governments that gut their role do so at our peril. The New Democratic Party believes in a Canada where we strive for more, not less, one where we take care of our responsibilities today and build for the future. We believe in a balanced, sustainable Canada where no one's left behind. I know the UFCW shares these goals, both for Canada and the United States. We've done some important work together, and I hope that work will continue. Because the history of both our countries is filled with examples of what's possible when progressives of all stripes work together towards those common goals. The UFCW is already leading the way in building a stronger labour movement, one that's ready for the 21st century challenges. Members in Canada and the US are reaching out to young workers and those in vulnerable service sector jobs. They're organizing, they're raising funds, and they're building support. New Democrats will continue to support you in that important work, and will continue to fight for a more hopeful, optimistic vision, a vision for a stronger, fairer Canada, where we lift each other up. Ensemble, nous pouvons faire de notre vision une réalité. Et ensemble, nous pouvons bâtir un monde meilleur, non seulement pour les générations actuelles, mais pour celles à venir. Together, we can make our vision a reality, and together, we can build a better world, not just for today, but for generations to come. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.